hands for the president.
Wow. Welcome back, everyone. Everyone looks nice and tan from spring break. I am very excited about tonight's debate for many reasons, including that the combined age of our guests tonight is less than the age of most of the other guests we've had. This will be the first joint debate that the YPU has had many years, including at all of my time at Yale. And I could not be more excited about the two people that we're hosting. Ross Barkan is a journalist, a novelist, and a political commentator whose next novel, Glass Century, is coming out in May. He is a man of the left. He's a democratic socialist, and a commentator on all things from movies and films to New York City politics. Emily Jashinsky is a culture writer based in D.C. She is a conservative. She's a culture editor at the Federalist magazine. She's now on the Barkan magazine, and is the co-host of the show Counterpoints, which is a show she hosts with another man on the left, Ryan Grimm, many times a week. I don't know how many times a week. It's really good. Anyways, and the two of them, we just had this a great dinner about the state of culture, youth, TikTok, and so I encourage you to ask whatever's on your mind about the state of American culture and our cultural elites. For anyone that is new to the Union tonight, we have a few traditions worth mentioning. One of our most unique traditions is that we tap for all those ideas with which we agree, and kiss all those ideas which we disdain. And there are some things that we all disdain at the Union, including the use of laptops during debate, leaving before the guests give closing remarks, forgetting to sign in if you're a member of the party, if you're a member of one of the parties, and the unwanted recording of student speeches. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I move that the Yale Political Union debate resolved, reject our cultural elites.
Second. 30 seconds and no objection. It is so moved. Is there a first doctorate speech in the affirmative?
Yes.
Wonderful. So this speech.
Hello, hello, hello. I think I should have had a drink before doing this. All right, so nuking North Korea. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for hosting this important conversation. I appreciate it. Today's cultural elites have many unfortunate qualities, but perhaps the most telling is their habit of following power and profit over any coherent principle. Outside, of course, the pursuit of power and profit as a principle in and of itself. This is how you go from hating Donald Trump to lavishing him with praise. This is how you go from embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion to rejecting it. This is how you flip-flop completely on trans athletes. It's how you go from decrying the cruelty of Donald Trump's immigration policies to implementing them yourself. It's how you go from calling TikTok a Chinese spy app until a major donor intervenes and your whole party suddenly loves it. Or how you go from praising Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein as close friends to saying you knew nothing of their monstrous private conduct. These are not aberrations. In many of these cases, they are industry-wide, from the top of finance to the top of Hollywood to the top of journalism and media. Right now, some of the most powerful men in the country, people who hated Donald Trump and in some cases actually fought against him and his supporters, are throwing money and praise at the president. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Elon Musk, we all know the names. Gavin Newsom is throwing his prior position on trans athletes under the bus. He's falsely claiming his office never used the word Latinx, despite using it himself on camera. Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan, or what I like to call the actual Bank of America, was once a vocal leader in the stakeholder capitalism movement, and now he's slouching away from DEI. BlackRock went from boasting about ESG to cutting it. All of this in a matter of years, in some cases months, not in a matter of decades, and for people with vast amounts of power. Some of it unelected, as in the case of Wall Street, vast amounts of power over our everyday lives, and it is utterly shameless. Worse, it represents the ethos of our cultural elites. How do we know that? Because they're all comfortable doing it all of the time, and they are getting away with it. And they bear significant blame, not only for these egregiously disingenuous flip-flops, but for major national trends. Opioid addiction, failed wars, rising teen suicides, declining life expectancy, and falling rates of happiness. We must reject America's cultural elites because we must reject the decline over which they preside. I anticipate the other side tonight will share some genuine good news about the state of American life in 2025, and I will say right away that I accept it. I accept the good. Relative to other periods of history, this is a wonderful time to be alive on average, but it's not getting better. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. Today, the average American is expected to die earlier than in 2014. Life expectancy began declining that year, according to the CDC, and while those numbers show nearly a return to pre-pandemic levels, life expectancy is still lower than what it was. According to Yale, teen suicide rates are spiking, quote, dramatically. We are doing something wrong, both as individuals and as a collective. It is decline, it is being driven by the top, and its owners must be rejected for that reason alone. Of course, we could dedicate an entire debate to defining the category of cultural elites, though Ross and I agreed ahead of time to a fairly broad definition. Not relegated to the infamous 1% or the penthouses of coastal enclaves. In Coming Apart, which has been used by PBS, by the Washington Post over the years, Charles Murray defined the new upper class as the, quote, most successful 5% of adults ages 25 and older who are working in managerial positions in the professions, medicine, the law, engineering and architecture, the sciences, and university faculty, and in content production jobs and media. Those are the elites in question here tonight. They're the more educated, higher earning members of our workforce, whether they're in Tuscaloosa, Park Avenue, or right here in New Haven. They're Jeff Bezos, but they're also the doctors in Wichita and Orange County who wrote oxycodone prescriptions for cash. And that, of course, by the way, includes me, and will likely include all of you after you graduate, so there's some self-reflection on the table here tonight. So let us prove this case that we are in a period of decline, and our cultural elites are to blame. Those are the two criteria that must be satisfied tonight. American life expectancy, let's start with this, while historically high, compares poorly with peer nations. This is damning information on its own. Late last year, a Johns Hopkins study found that life expectancy in the U.S. is on average 78.6 years. In England and Wales, it is 81.3 years. That is a 2.7-year difference. And that analysis actually found that what it describes as preventable causes, like heart disease, overdose deaths, firearms, and car crashes, accounted for the gap. Hopkins found, quote, the U.S. death rate due to cardiovascular health issues is 38% greater than England and Wales, and the U.S. overdose death rate is more than 3 times greater. More than 3 times greater, England and Wales. 31.6% per 100,000 versus 9.3 per 100,000. Of course, all of us can work hard in our personal lives to prevent heart disease and overdoses, but cultural elites have knowingly stacked the deck against our health on both of those, marketing certain foods and medications as safe for the sake of their own profit, successfully lobbying our representatives in Congress behind closed doors, and that is endemic corruption. They must be rejected in order for us to reject endemic corruption that is literally causing excess mortality and worsening the everyday lives of people in our country. It's true that people have been prosecuted for some of this, and they've been reported on by their fellow elites in media. Elites do police elites, but in these cases, long after the damage has been done, for the most part, and even then, very infrequently. This is the most dramatic example on the table tonight. It reminds me very much of the debate over tobacco. And what we see here is power and profit being prioritized over coherent principles that aren't power and profit for the sake of power and profit. Both the Washington Post and the Columbia Journalism Review, if we move to politics, have since published extensive multi-part series on how the media for years promoted a false narrative in daily headlines that Donald Trump in 2016 colluded with the Kremlin to win the presidency. This is a quote from Jeff Gerth in 2023. He spent 3 decades as an investigative reporter for the New York Times. He wrote, "My main conclusion is that journalism's primary missions, informing the public and holding powerful interests accountable, have been undermined by the erosion of journalistic norms and the media's own lack of transparency about its work. This combination adds to people's distrust about the media and exacerbates frayed political and social differences." Now, Russia, by the way, is a nuclear power and is not to be casually dealt with by journalists spinning these narratives without the lack of transparency that Gerth mentioned there. Many of you likely know the origin story of America's invasion of Iraq. The Bush administration cultivated public support and votes in Congress by spreading dubious information, which we now know to be untrue. Everywhere from Meet the Press to in the United Nations. And it was then repeated credulously by reporters at places like the New York Times. You may not know the names of the journalists whose bylines are on those stories. One of them actually is in the news just in the last 48 hours, Jeffrey Goldberg. There's also Judith Miller. Know that Jeffrey Goldberg is very much still in a position of power. Now, the Times aired so badly that by 2004, which was a full year after the invasion, the paper published an apology. In that apology, the Times conceded its failures were not limited to one person here or there. It wrote, "Some critics of our coverage during that time have focused blame on individual reporters. Our examination, however, indicates that the problem was more complicated. Editors at several levels who should have been challenging reporters and pressing for more skepticism were perhaps too intent on rushing scoops into the paper." Now, it's worth pausing there to underline something important. The Times was not just copying to its own failures in that apology of being too trusting of other elites. It was saying it failed to cover the failures of those other elites. The same was true in the failed Trump-Russia coverage. Reporters took the word of their sources in government, failed to do due diligence, and then those sources themselves either failed to do their own due diligence or were intentionally misleading the press. That is a circle of failure from cultural elites. If you've never read the Afghanistan papers, the Washington Post story from 2019 is essential. It begins like this. This quote is incredible. "A confidential trove of government documents obtained by the Washington Post reveals that senior U.S. officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan throughout the 18-year campaign, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence the war had become unwinnable." That story quotes a 3-star general saying, "If the American people knew the magnitude of this dysfunction, 2,400 lives lost, then, quote, blaming the deaths of U.S. military personnel and bureaucratic breakdowns among Congress, the Pentagon, and the State Department is what that 3-star general proceeded to do." 9/11 itself was a glaring intelligence failure, as a government since admitted. What about the Great Recession? Another rigorous analysis in the Columbia Journalism Review, no friend of the right, by the way, concluded in 2018, quote, "Journalism did fail. It failed to alert its readers to the coming disaster, to appreciate the complicity of the Wall Street banks, and to understand our ability or the ability or unwillingness of regulators to grasp the problem. That business journalists are still defending their role in a meltdown that happened 10 years ago speaks to how deep the criticism cut and how raw the debate still is." Again, that's 2 layers of failure. It's easy to beat up on the media, but when we're talking about the media in this case, we're talking about the media not allowing people in power to hide their failures, letting them get away with their failures. That is 2 layers. It is not just me punching at journalists, which is frankly one of the easiest things to do in the world these days. We know how predatory lending and lax regulation led to this crisis, from which many Americans have never recovered, which led, by the way, to this chaotic era of populism because people rightfully feel hopeless. We know only one banker went to jail. One banker went to jail to this day. The policemen on the beat, in media and in the regulatory world, failed to catch this. They failed to do their jobs, what civil society relies on. This is again a circle of elite failure. It is endemic. What about the lab leak? Let's have some fun. Most major media outlets published stories arguing it was, quote, a racist conspiracy theory. And it may not be right, by the way, and some racists may indeed have leveraged it. But most of our government now says it's true, and if that's the case, let us not forget, as some of my friends on the right often do, we funded that lab. So it's our failure, and it's failure of our cultural elites, people in those managerial positions, either way. Here's the New York Times, by the way, just last week, so 5 years after the pandemic, and 5 years after the New York Times and other outlets were calling this a conspiracy theory. Quote, "We have since learned, however, that to promote the appearance of consensus, some officials and scientists hid or understated critical facts, misled at least one reporter, orchestrated campaigns of supposedly independent voices, and even compared notes about how to hide their communications in order to keep the public from hearing the whole story. And as for that Wuhan laboratory's research, the details have since emerged, show that safety precautions might have been terrifyingly lax." I wonder who should have told us that. Sadly, many of you experienced prolonged school closures during the pandemic. I was in media at the time and can assure you it was absolutely taboo to suggest in the fall of 2020 that schools should be safely reopening. Well, here's the New York Times, once again, 4 years later, writing, quote, "A variety of data about children's academic outcomes and about the spread of COVID-19 has accumulated in the time since. Today, there's broad acknowledgement among many public health and education experts that extended school closures did not significantly stop the spread of COVID, while the academic harms for children have been large and long-lasting." And by the way, the leaders of this endemic disaster are paying themselves at mind-boggling levels. An Associated Press analysis found, quote, "The extraordinarily high level of the CEO to worker compensation ratio reflects the strikingly different trajectory of CEO pay compared to typical worker pay over the last 40 years. And this is important to pause on because it was not always this way. So on the one hand, the AP found there's been little growth in the compensation of a typical worker since the late 1970s. That's grown 24% over the 45 years from 78 to 23, despite a corresponding growth of net economic productivity of 74.8%. Meanwhile, the 1,085% growth in realized CEO compensation from 78 to 23 exceeded the growth in productivity in that period. So workers get 24% compensation growth for 75% productivity growth, and CEOs get 1,000%. That's enough in and of itself to reject our cultural elites who greenlight this on corporate boards across industries, and the journalists who barely ever cover it because their own parent companies are implicated. According again to Johns Hopkins, 77% of Americans trusted the government in 1964. That number is now 20%. It went from a big majority to a small minority in less than my mother's lifetime. These are not minor failures, nor do I think they are her failures, to be fair. I'm not blowing this out of proportion. They are repeated, they are a pattern, and they involve the leaders of every major aspect of society. It is true we live longer than people did 100 years ago, and that we continue to innovate, and TVs are better and cheaper, even while college tuition, houses, and healthcare are more expensive. Arthur Brooks wrote about this paradox of declining happiness and increasing material comfort back in 2020 in The Atlantic. It's very sober. He wrote, "According to the Census Bureau, average household income in the U.S. was higher in 2019 than is ever recorded for every income quintile adjusted for inflation. And although income inequality has risen, it has not been mirrored by inequality in the consumption of goods and services. American homes in 2016, new ones, were 1,000 square feet larger than in 1973, and living space per person on average has nearly doubled. But amid these advances in quality of life across the income scale, average happiness is decreasing in the U.S. The General Social Survey, which has been measuring social trends among Americans every 1 or 2 years since 1972, shows a long-term gradual decline in happiness and a rise in unhappiness from 1988 to the present. Institutional trust is low, happiness is low, life expectancy is declining. Meanwhile, the very top is rewarding itself at higher levels. There have been few consequences for what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, during the Great Recession, or COVID. Purdue Pharma still exists. Most of these errors were admitted later, if at all. Personally, I'm from part of the country that was rocked by economic transformation from globalization. Some of it's been good, but I can tell you firsthand, as many of you probably can as well, that these institutional failures in recent decades are exactly why people support Donald Trump. Paper mill towns were hollowed out, when even Democrats voted for policies like NAFTA on the assurance there would be job training and programs to help their constituents that never came. Then people were overprescribed opioids by doctors they trusted in those neighborhoods. And I'm one of those people, this is going to get some hisses, who wishes Trump was not the man that many of my fellow Wisconsinites projected their hopes onto. But if the elites refuse to learn from their own errors, that people feel they have nowhere left to turn. And that is why I reject our cultural elites. Because because they've created desperate times that are forcing people into desperate measures. But you don't have to agree with me on that to agree with this resolution. You need to reject the leadership of a society that lives shorter lives now than it did in 2014. The leadership of a society that recently oversaw 2 failed wars, that botched a pandemic response, where teen suicides are spiking and happiness is falling. That is decline, plain and simple. The leaders in a period of decline deserve to be rejected, especially when there's a clear-cut record of major failures on major problems: finance, public health, war, and they keep paying themselves more. And I will give one more example because it's the silliest, but one that really illustrates what happens across the board. Joe Biden was ailing. Since he struggled to get through 10 minutes of a debate without freezing and claiming the total defeat of Medicaid, media outlets have done deep dives into that cover-up. It involved them. It involved members of Congress, it involved celebrities in Hollywood, and it involved business leaders who went to fundraisers and noticed this and talked amongst themselves about it but never went public. It also resulted in millions of primary voters' ballots being tossed out at the last minute and the nomination being thrown to the hands of the DNC. These cultural elites from Washington to Wall Street to Hollywood did not just stay silent and hope for the best. They actively lied and misdirected us. Then flipped on a dime as soon as Biden's problem became public in the debate, going from saying he was young and spry to unwell, so much so that he should drop out. And they feigned shock about it too, utterly shameless, and this is where you see power and profit coming before principle. Combine that with the whiplash-inducing turnarounds from tech CEOs who went from slamming Trump from their deeply held moral principles to standing behind him at his inauguration, paying themselves 1,000% more for 75% productivity gains, and their workers 24% more. It is sick, it is clearly endemic, it is clearly bipartisan, and it obviously needs to be rejected. To vote to reject our elites is not to vote to replace them or become Jacobins, it's just a vote to reject them. We needn't throw the baby of our modern comforts out with the bathwater of corruption. Reject decline, reject the cultural elites who pushed us into it, or vote against the resolution, and vote to accept the broad and endemic failures of our cultural elites. Last thing, this has happened in the proudest moments of our history. In the first Gilded Age, we rejected our cultural elites. Had we accepted and tolerated much more of their lust for money and power without democratic restraints, and without shame driven by popular movements, we'd have relegated child laborers and factory workers and miners and food consumers to prolonged suffering. When a ship veers off course, we do not accept the leadership because the ship is moving. Reject our cultural elites. It's our only option to stop this situation.
Questions for Mr. Jashinsky? More science in society. The Peter Schroeder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank Mr. Jashinsky for his speech. If we are to reject the cultural elites, who are we replacing them with? Or does Mr. Jashinsky envision an elite less world, like a classless society?
But we must replace it, where we must create incentives, right? You may be replaced if you do not improve. Right? That's incentives for improvement. So replace perhaps partially by better versions of ourselves, or replaced by people who are more worthy. But there needs to be an incentive structure among the good people here at Yale and the good people in the United States to improve or get thrown overboard to continue torturing the shit metaphor.
The follow-up.
Who is more worthy?
Ooh, well, I guess I could go full William F. Buckley here. Just the first 10 names in the Boston phone book over our... I don't know that is necessarily true, but I might take 5 of them, and I might take a better other 5 if we're talking about this hypothetical 10. People who understand, actually we've seen this in media, we've seen a slight change in media of people suddenly realizing the public will reward them financially if they continue to ask tough questions, investigate the worthy topics. So something good, it's a glimmer of hope, so perhaps they can be reformed.
Further questions? Floor leader to the left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just kind of curious about this overall issue, like how our elites are at things. I'm part of this. I'm an oil and gas lobbyist. I was just on the Hill for a week, meeting members of Congress, and time and again, the ultimate question we come at is they're not willing to stick their necks out because they're afraid of not getting reelected. You know, the media is not afraid to report on Donald Trump because they're afraid of repercussions. Columbia University just gave up a million of their biggest, most important policy stances to the federal government because they weren't willing to stand on principle. And time and again, I keep coming back to this issue of greed, right? Our entire society seems to revolve around greed. Do you think that our cultural elites are a product of like capitalism and our hyper-capitalistic society? If so, like, what is it? Is there a solution within our current economic system that rewards this endless pursuit of profit?
Shame. We need to bring back shame. You pay yourself 1,085% more. That should be so shameful that you don't show your face at the Oscars. And the country used to do that. There should be a sense of shame. There truly should be a sense of shame. And listen, I'm a person of the right. The oil and gas lobby has attempted to hijack the green energy movement, and this is one of the best examples of power and profit actually coming before any kind of coherent principle, right? It's time and again. We will, of course, we love and respect the planet. It's PR. It's always a mask now. It should be so shameful to show your face at the Oscars or at the Kennedy Center Honors or at the White House Correspondents' Center if you behave that way. But because the culture of our elites is such that this is the norm, we need shame so that it is not the norm. And the only way we can do that is by some sort of popular uprising, whether it's mass unionization, whether it's movements like these, or whether it's conversations like these, or people unsubscribing to the New York Times. Oh, sorry.
Further questions?
Thank you for your speech. It seems like most of the issues you have with cultural elites are that the managerial class is A, made mistakes, and B, is self-interested. Now, I mean, separate from the notion of no leaders, the reality is that there will be leaders. So let's say these leaders, we replace these leaders. Do you really think there's some massive regulatory system in which shame is implemented, which can possibly keep leaders from A, making mistakes, which they will, and B, being self-interested?
In the words of John Adams, ours is a system fit only for a moral and religious people, and no other. No other. Now, there's an interesting question as to whether capitalism necessarily engenders secularism, and that is a conversation people like Patrick Deneen are having here about slaves. I don't necessarily buy into that, but I do think that a culture of genuine shame when it comes to avarice is something that we have completely thrown out the door. If you look at influencer culture, if you look at the things that are rewarded in American society, it is not shameful to be predatory. It is not shameful to be exploited. It's not even shameful to be wrong for years because your fellow elites will continue rewarding you beyond even the powers of the market. Now that, like I said, in media, we're seeing some glimmers of hope. Maybe that's not entirely true. But the only way we will either get better or learn if it's true is to reject the current leadership of the ship and not applaud because it continues to move forward.
For a final question. Sometimes I'm probably right.
Thank you. The guest seemed to imply in her speech that things have gotten worse. So I was curious about what's changed, particularly since we are at Yale University. What's changed about our elite production, especially given the fact that institutions like Yale are trying to be more meritorious and less elitist? Is that the wrong direction?
No, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And my answer would be the same sort of economic principle I will apply to academia, which is that monopolization fuels incompetence and inefficiency. And I think academia was monopolized. And I think that may be changing too, we will see. This conversation has proven in and of itself that the direction may be changing. I don't think when I was in college a mere 10 years ago, this conversation would happen as openly as it is right now. But I think monopolization, and this is from the right, a concern I have with Elon Musk suddenly finding his way into some more SpaceX contracts and Starlink contracts. The more economic power you have, the less competition you have, the less efficient, the less competent you become. I think that will happen to our elite class, and I think it's time for some better competition.
With that, Mr. Jashinsky, thanks.